My name is Charles Eisenstein. I am from the United States. I'm a writer and a speaker. I've become really fed up with critique, actually. Not that it doesn't have its place, but there's obviously a limit to critique. Because it doesn't necessarily hold a vision for an alternative. So one thing I like about the localization movement is there is kind of a vision of an alternative that isn't just about, well, let's stop doing this, but actually there's a positive direction that can guide a series of political choices. Because, it's not only, so on one level, I'm impatient with critique. Secondly, then you say, okay, well, let's propose some solutions. But how do you then implement the solutions? Like, what good does it do to propose solutions or to propose a vision that is so far from where society is, where institutions are, where people's consciousness is, that you might as well be writing a utopian novel. So localization offers kind of a North Star that you can use to examine, not only critique, the system, but also choose an alternative. Like, you can ask the question, does this restore connections on a more local level? Or does it further attenuate those connections? Does it connect us instead with something beyond the reach of our physical senses and of our in-person relationships? And, I guess, like, on a more philosophical level, what is localization really about? It's about increasing the density and the complexity and the richness of local connections, with people and places and beings, plants, animals, water, air, like all of the things that create a place. Because you could say, well, everyone's local already. They're only living in, they're living where they live, right? That's local, right? What does it actually mean? It's all about relationship. So I think that the localization movement is part of a much larger trend toward, or maybe I wouldn't even call it a trend yet, but it's a desire to restore our connections, because we've been so fragmented and so alienated that our very beingness begins to decay, because who we are is relationship. So that's the, if not yet a trend, it is the transition in civilization that is available to us now for our choosing. Do we continue deeper and deeper into separation? Or do we take a pause, turn around, and begin walking the roads that converge again, and understand ourselves as relational beings fundamentally, and stop replacing our real relationships with these attenuated relationships mediated by markets and technology? So that's where localization fits into my larger worldview. If it were up to our own force to resist the forces of globalization, the forces of militarization, the forces of financialization, then it would be a futile struggle. But there are larger forces than the human that are at work here. You could call them historical forces or archetypal forces. Civilizations have a lifespan, just like any other being. And I think most people recognize that our civilization is, in a certain sense, senescent. It's moribund. It's not vital anymore. It's just continuing on the momentum of habits established long ago, and ideologies that were established long ago, hidden ideologies. I don't mean like the explicit ones, but all going down to a metaphysical level about what a human being fundamentally is, and what the world is. This deterministic, force-based, material world of rational causality, all that, that whole worldview, that seeks to colonize all of creation with our concepts and our metrics, and treat life as a min-max problem. Like, that entire mindset is not bringing the promised results. People are becoming less and less happy. And we're unable, seemingly, especially in my country, in the US, we're unable to really do anything new. We're trapped by our habits and by our institutions and by our economy. Everybody participating in a world that, in a future that nobody actually really wants. And the pale substitute for a vision that is offered by these technological visions of utopia is no longer compelling. People are not seeing life getting better and better and better as it was supposed to. So that aging of our civilization is what creates the opportunities for us to choose something different. And every time that there is a next stage of collapse, there's an opportunity to make a different choice. Collapse won't save us in and of itself. It's not like there's one final, like one birth event that happens to us that then propels us into a new era. Only becomes a birth event if we choose to undergo the birth. There's a moment of readiness. The intensity of denying that moment grows and grows. It becomes harder and harder to stay where we are. But it is ultimately a choice. If I like to say, if collapse were going to save us, it already would have. 80% of the insects are gone. And you would expect that if that had happened, people would be like, oh my God, we got to change now. But no. Well, so why do we think another 80% collapse would be any different? Or another, or another, or another, until there aren't any left. Last year, there were hardly any fireflies anywhere that I saw, in the northeast of the US. And some people remarked on it, but there wasn't like panic in the streets. So each crisis that we face is an opportunity to choose a new path. And so the question for me, as someone actively trying to serve a more beautiful world, the question for me is how do we prepare to make the right choice? What is the ground of preparation? And it includes knowledge, information, even critique. Because critique, the one way that it's really helpful is that it validates people's intuitions that there's something wrong here. Otherwise, you think you're crazy because nobody else is acting as if there's something terribly wrong here. They're taking their pills and they're functioning. So maybe I'm the crazy one. So critique serves like a very potent psychological function that helps us, when the moment of choice comes, to make a different choice. So that's one way to prepare the ground. And there are also like felt, embodied experiences that contradict the ideology of separation, that connect us with the foundation of a new story of relationality and interconnection and interbeing. And so anything that we do to reestablish connections sets the stage for a different choice. And because otherwise it seems really futile. You're just gonna start a farmer's market, or do some small land-based project. How is that gonna help against the crushing machine of late-stage capitalism? Although they've been calling it late-stage capitalism now for like my entire lifetime. How late does it have to get? There's a certain assumption of inevitability when we talk about late-stage capitalism. And again, it'll hang on as long as we hang on to it. There's an inescapable necessity to choose. And so even on more subtle levels, cultivating our freedom to choose helps set the stage for what you might call the revolution. Reestablishing our sovereignty and our will, that has been co-opted by so many forces, and how, and habituated us to essentially an authoritarian society. It's not as brutally obvious, especially for affluent people, that it is authoritarian. You don't see people marching with jackboots in the streets. You don't see that kind of classic authoritarian facade, not a facade, classic authoritarian expression. But nonetheless, this is how the critique of schooling fits into this too. That's training in surrendering your will, not to a community, but to distant authorities. And so I don't want to make it seem like this just an individual thing to recover your will. It's fundamentally relational as well. So who do you choose to relate to? And yeah, you're not going to be able to wave a magic wand and recreate the kind of tight-knit communities that once were the fabric of human existence. But when people have the realization of the desire to return to connection, to be fully relationally embodied here, then the opportunities begin to become visible to them. Maybe they were always there, or maybe you've magnetized them to you. Doesn't matter. They become visible. And guided by that North Star of, well, you could call it localization, but it's really the reestablishment of tangible connections. Then you begin to make different choices. There is this debate, does it all start with interchange and then the system will change in reflection of that, or do you need to change the system because the system enforces who we are being? It's hard to be fully generous and in full abundance and so forth when everybody around you is trying to get the best deal for themselves. And you give it all away, and it's not like you're living in a traditional village where people will give to you also. There are plenty of, salespeople and internet marketers and people who are be just as happy to take everything you've gotten, everything you have, and there will be no repercussions from the community because, they live 1,000 miles away. So yeah, I understand this debate very well. Why are we asking the question, do you change inside or do you work on systems change? As if we have to figure out a plan for how change happens and then execute that plan. Why is the first step to fit everything into an intellectual understanding that tells us that has us know what to do? So I can see both arguments, and arguments for working within the system and working outside the system, same pattern of argument. But people like to delude themselves into thinking that they figure something out and then they know what to do. But for me, it's more like I do something and then I begin to figure things out. And so then really the question underneath the question about do you do inner work or outer work, in the system, out of the system, really what that question comes down to is, what do I do? How do I know what to do? How do I make choices in my life? And I think that maybe the beginning of an answer to that is, you gather information with your mind, and then you trust that as you metabolize that information and it penetrates deeper into your organs, into your blood, into your heart, then you make choices that take that information into account, but also take into account more embodied wisdom and information that comes from sources that are not well recognized by modern thinking. And you know what to do. And you find yourself in the right place at the right time. And you have a feeling of satisfaction. You have a feeling that I am doing what I'm here to do. And somebody might come and critique what you're doing and say, well, don't you know that this will never change the system? Or don't you know that trying to change the system is futile and you really have to change yourself? And like they have all these, but you actually know that you are doing what is yours to do. So that prescription does not give us a formula for systems change. And I think that it's good that we have no formula, because a lot of people have come up with a lot of brilliant formulas for here's how to change the world. We have to do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And everybody else, someone else, no, I've got a plan. It's to do step A, B, C, and D. And then someone else has another plan. And then you start debating about it. And the underlying assumption is that the ideal change for the world will be the result of some smart people getting into a room and arguing with each other until finally one of them prevails. How has that been working for us? Not that well. Has not been working for us. And so, and that whole approach, that whole kind of design, critique and design mentality is itself part of the story and the system that we are immersed in right now. So really we need to step into the mystery, into the unknown, and accept our not knowing and be okay with that. It's not that we can't know anything. No, not going to say that. I mean, in some sense, it's true. You can't know, whatever. But that's not my point. My point is that there are always going to be things outside of the limits of our knowledge. And that right now, those are becoming especially apparent, because if we knew so much, we would be living in a utopia by now. That's what the pioneers of science were predicting. You know, this is going to usher in a new age of man. Hope is a premonition. It comes from a connection to a future that you know in your heart is possible. It's not a fantasy. And you know there's a way to get there, but you may not know how. Hope does not come from knowing how. Hope comes from knowing that there is a path. Sometimes a plan of how can bolster your hope and affirm your hope. But hope does not depend on knowing how to get there. But it does depend on knowing that you can get there. And that's why if you do not do what you know is yours to do, you will lose hope. Because then you no longer know that you can.